We should be good to go. I'm Jessie Parris, and I'm going to be moderating. So I will start off with just a little bit about myself. My pronouns are she, her, and I am recently finished PhD academic. Also an actor, so my research is around disability representation and employment in the arts. So yeah, that's the perspective that I'm coming from, but also I'm bisexual. So I'm really passionate about intersectional representation as well. And also for anyone who it might be useful for, I'll just audio describe myself and I'll ask each of the panelists if you're happy to audio describe yourselves as well. So I'm a white woman. I'm in my late 20s, and I have short-ish, although it's got longer in lockdown, brown hair and brown eyes. I'm a powered wheelchair user, although you can't really see that. And I'm currently wearing a t-shirt which you can't really see either, but it's blue and it's got a unicorn with the bi pride colours for its mane, and it says real as hell, because I thought that that was quite appropriate for tonight. Yeah, so if we could go to the next panelist, please, because I know Beth, I'm going to be mean and go to you.
Yeah, of course. My name is Beth Hinton-Lever. My pronouns are she, her. I was born without my lower right forearm, so I am a disabled actor. I came to acting quite late, so my BA is in classical archaeology and classical civilizations. So a bit different, but yeah, I'm an actor. Most of my work has been in musical theatre on stage. I'm pansexual, and I'm really excited to be here. I'm 5'2", but I'm sat down right now. I'm white. I am wearing quite heavy eye makeup, and I have a really deep side fringe. Still living my emo phase and fantasy. Yeah, I think that's everything.
Umber?
Hello, I'm Umber. I use they, them pronouns. I am a makeup artist from London, and I London still. And I have invisible disabilities, multiple. I don't know whether to label things or not, what that's like you're asking for. And I have brown skin, and I've never audio described before, so okay, I have brown skin and dark blonde long hair, and I'm wearing soft glam makeup. And yeah, I'm 5'3", and I'm just sitting in my living room in my nicest looking area.
Fab. Thank you. And Josh?
Yeah, so I'm Josh. I am a journalist. My day job is in local news, but I've written for other titles, freelance, and some LGBT media outlets as well. I'm deaf, so I was born deaf. And yeah, audio describing myself. So I'm not wearing anything as exciting as Jessie's wearing. There's no unicorns, and I've got no eye makeup either. So I'm how would I describe myself? Blonde, brownish hair, 5'7" at a push, wearing a very boring blue button-up shirt. Yeah, and I think that's the best description I can give.
Great. That seems perfect. And diversity is important, so I'm glad that we're not all being too out there, because I think that's possibly going to be part of the conversation about how comfortable we feel in different aspects of our identity. So yeah, I think that's a nice place to start. The first question that Becky and I have sort of come up with together is about how LGBT plus spaces and organisations are generally inclusive of and accessible to deaf and disabled people or not. So based around our experiences of that, essentially. And because I started last time, I'm not going to start now. Does anybody have anything particular they want to say about that?
It's always tricky going first. I think it's kind of important to distinguish between spaces as kind of physical spaces and sort of a more broad kind of space. Physically, I think most sort of obvious manifestation of LGBT spaces, you know, like nightclubs and bars and things like that, that's quite obviously not very accessible to a lot of people in different ways. So if I think for myself, I'm deaf. If you're going to a bar, if you're going to a club, you're not really, it's not very accessible because of all the noise, background noise, the music, and so on and so forth. And the same, I'm sure, would apply for people with other disabilities too. But then there's obviously that broader question around LGBT spaces that aren't physical, and whether they're more accessible as well. But I think in the most sort of obvious literal manifestation of as you know, physical concrete places, there are examples where they could be more accessible.
Great.
I agree. I think for me, a lot of the kind of, as Josh said, LGBT spaces in the physical realm, they're not accessible just because a lot of them tend to be in basements, in my experience, actually. So they're not physically accessible. But I guess in the online realm, it's quite strange for me because I think people expect gay people to look a certain way, or they presume that, oh, well, if you're disabled, you like, how many more boxes can you tick, I guess. So like things like social media, it is sometimes quite scary to be out, I guess, because I don't think I tick the boxes that people expect me to tick. So in that sense, it's even if it is internalized homophobia and kind of ableism there, it doesn't feel accessible to me.
Yeah, I agree in terms of accessibility in real life. It's difficult because when you have a more, like, a lot of these spaces are quite low budget, so they don't tend to have accessible venues and they don't tend to have seating. They're also often very noisy and crowded, which is difficult for people with lots of different types of disabilities. For me, I find it very difficult to stand up for hours at a time, or be in spaces where I can't really sit down and stuff, so I tend to just avoid going to physical spaces. And the other side of things is more the academic kind of conferencey spaces, which are a bit better for me, but I still find them quite overwhelming as someone who has a lot of fatigue type symptoms, because they tend to be really long with very short breaks. Really tend to take into account different people's abilities. I think, again, it is a budget a lot of the time, but budget is also the priorities with budget don't go towards accessibility, so it is a choice.
Yeah, I think that's a really, really interesting one about the kind of split between the physical and the online spaces particularly, but also your point about budget, I think, is really true. And I know Beth and I have had conversations about budgets around accessibility in theatre, and I think that's something that carries over into other kind of mass organised events, whether that be indoors or outdoors. And I relate to in terms of the physical inaccessible things. And as Beth said, I think a lot of it is because things are in basements or underground. And on one level, I understand where that comes from, because historically we had to be very, very careful, and a lot of people still do have to be very, very careful. So we often had spaces that were formed in the only places that they could be formed, but that is then difficult for those of us with bodies and minds that don't adhere well to those kind of spaces. So I think it's a conversation that needs to be had in terms of the future, but also transforming the spaces that are already there. And that conversation leads on really nicely to the second question that we've developed, which is how have you felt that accessibility has changed during this current situation that we find ourselves in, and lockdown and COVID times? And has that meant that things are more or less inclusive and accessible? Yeah.
More accessible under lockdown. I think a lot of people have expressed the same to me, that because things are more based on being at home, and also as sometimes aren't strictly at home, you can really be flexible with what works for you. I think events under lockdown, online events, have been a lot for me, and I've actually managed to create more.
Great.
Yeah, and to add to that, I think it's also made people. So I've also found it more accessible under lockdown. I think people with lots of disabilities probably have. I think it's also made a lot of people who are able-bodied or don't have any disabilities at all think a bit more about how they can adapt their own either social gatherings or work practices or whatever it might be in different ways to make sure that everyone's included. Now, obviously, it would have been nice if that had come from listening to disabled people from the get-go, maybe. But it's a positive change nonetheless. I think that you can now businesses, for example, are much more likely to have Zoom calls and not make employees come in physically into the office, or somebody might do a quiz night over Zoom rather than going to a club that's not accessible. So yeah, I think generally I would agree. I think it's more accessible.
Yeah, I'd agree with that as well. I think also with kind of my own anxiety, I get quite bad anxiety with kind of social meetings a lot of the time, especially if I feel like I have to be performing in some way, performative in kind of my own presentation. So the fact that, as we've said, it's all kind of happening on Zoom, where you can mute yourself, turn off your camera. If anything gets too much, it feels easier than it did to kind of have to apologise in person if I needed a rest break, or it has been more accessible. But on that, as Josh said, it would have been really nice if kind of captions were thought of when deaf and disabled communities first started asking for them, years ago. But I'm hoping that a lot of the lessons that we've learned from lockdown will continue, but that's yet to be seen because we're still in lockdown, but hopefully. That's
really interesting, because I largely agree that things have been more accessible for me, but on the flip side, in terms of mental health, I've found the kind of technological fatigue to really come across, and that wasn't something that I was prepared for. I don't think because I already spent quite a bit of time online as a disabled person. I think a lot of people in the disability community do, but now having that being the only option, it's made me realise how much I missed the spontaneous connection with people. And I was quite surprised by how much force I felt around using Pride this year because it wasn't something that was happening, and obviously from a health point of view, as someone who isn't shielding but is potentially vulnerable, I wasn't even contemplating going if they had been on. But I've really noticed, because a lot of the physical spaces aren't accessible to me, that it's the one kind of public space in which I can be open about my identity. And so there was this bittersweet feeling for me around Pride, which was interesting. It wasn't something that I had expected, but yeah. So, and I guess coming off from that, the third question we have to think about is, if LGBT plus spaces and organisations want to be more inclusive to disabled people, what should they be doing, and which spaces could be a good example to them? And I would start off by saying, actually, I think particularly at Pride in London, which is the only one that I've really attended, but although obviously some of the nature of the event is quite overwhelming generally, they do seem to make a lot of effort to be as accessible as possible, particularly if you are participating in the parade. There's an access safe space that you can join, and that was why I first went along, because I didn't know that it was a thing, and then my friends told me and were really excited. So I think just having that consideration there, the emotion behind that, aside from anything else, it's really nice to know that people have actually thought about it. I don't know how you folks feel about other spaces and what could be done better, but.
Well, I think on the Pride point, I would agree with that about the accessibility of Pride as well. I mean, I've marched in the parade for the past 2 years with Action on Hearing Loss, and I think one of the great things about it is not just the consideration to physical accessibility, but also the fact that they make space within the parade for disability groups, advocacy groups, and things like that. Because to me, it felt like I wasn't going to Pride just as a gay man. I was going to Pride as a deaf person, which is, empowering in itself, having been there for, not just because of being LGBT, but because I'm deaf as well. So kind of harking back to what you were saying, I really miss it this year too. On the accessibility thing, I think what people could do to improve, I kind of think the key thing is, the only real key answer, I think, is listening to disabled people, because there's no one-size-fits-all kind of way to make a venue more accessible, or way to make a gathering more accessible, or whatever it might be. I think you just have to, listen to what the deaf and disabled people who might be attending the service or the event or whatever it might be, are telling you about what they need, and then make those changes accordingly. I think that's the key thing, really.
Yeah, I definitely.
Sorry.
Oh, you go, Umber. You go.
Super awkward, isn't it? Yeah, I did. I think I missed out on the feeling of togetherness this year. I haven't actually been to Pride before. I started this event called Queer Picnic with a few other queer and trans people of colour, and it was an alternative to Pride, because not just as a disabled person, but a person of colour, Pride has never felt like a space for me, and I've never felt safe or comfortable going, just with the strong police presence, the army, things like that, having ancestors experience and colonizing. It never felt like the place for me. So I definitely made a picnic this year, and running it, even though it's always really stressful, I think because one of the leadership, me, is disabled, whenever people who are disabled want to attend and they ask for things, we always make sure it happens. And I think it made me realise that actually, if you think that these things are important enough, you will make sure they happen, budget because we don't have any money. So I think that was it would have been the fifth year that we've done it. So yeah, the loneliness thing is very real. But I think that's just something I've been, because part of having my disability means I've had regular surgery and I've said fatigue as well. So often I do just sit in my flat for weeks, sometimes months. So lockdown hasn't felt that different to my normal issues with isolation. But it's kind of interesting to see how people who go out every single day have reacted to that. And a lot of able people have found the isolation very unmanageable. And that's really interesting. And it kind of makes me feel a bit less alone.
Yeah, I was actually going to say something really similar on the it's not that different for me, but watching kind of a lot of my friends really struggle and kind of realize that there are barriers. Kind of that was an interesting thing to watch my able-bodied friends realize, kind of in a very different way, but in a tiny way, some barriers that the disabled community and the deaf community can face. I guess for kind of going back to what Josh was saying, which I agree with, if you want to make yourself more accessible, you should go to the community you're trying to benefit, because they know themselves better than you do and better than anyone else does. But we're all different. You can tell that just from this Zoom call. And I think one thing to say, just from kind of having done it a lot in lockdown, which is wonderful, but it's so tiring, is when you are going to disabled people to ask them about either their experience or how to make things more accessible, the emotional kind of toll and the physical toll is a lot. So I guess do it in a space that is safe. Try and set up, if it's going to be a formal meeting, try and set up something formal. Don't kind of ask and expect an immediate response and then say, oh, but we did consult a disabled person. You spoke to one person. So I think there's been a bit of that for me in lockdown, which has made it slightly more tiring, just to try and speak for a community that I'm part of, but I'm not a spokesperson for. I just live that. That's my experience. That's been quite tiring. So I guess that would just be something to say for any able-bodied and non-disabled people who might watch and listen, to just think about, I guess. But yeah, I've missed the community. I've missed all of my community so much. But Pride for me actually isn't a space where I went, but I never felt 100% there. And that's no one's fault. It just, I don't, as I said earlier, I don't think I fit into a category neatly enough. But that also falls in with me being pansexual and things like that. So it's given me a lot more time to kind of think and meet other people that I never would have met, which has been amazing. But yeah.
I think that's really, really interesting, and some really important points about how Pride is quite a paradoxical space in some ways. And I think, yeah, that's really important to remember. And I think part of the reason that I find it so freeing is that actually it was one of the only spaces that was really physically accessible to me. So then it's a bit of a low bar. As much as elements of Pride have been wonderful, I really, really acknowledge that there are aspects that are problematic as well. So yeah, just for clarity on that. But jumping off Beth's point about really talking to the community and the emotional labour that we've all brought up, actually. The next question that we have to think about is how can non-disabled members of our community specifically be better allies to deaf and disabled people?
I think I've been thinking about allies a lot at the moment, and a lot of people have asked me how to be a better ally, and I always kind of come back to the idea that it shouldn't be virtue signaling. So I shouldn't have to be in the room for you to stand up for my rights. If you see an injustice, it should just kind of be a knee-jerk, well, I'm going to say something, because it can be terrifying as a member of the community that's at kind of risk of ableism or homophobia to kind of do it ourselves in a way. Sometimes we're not the safest people to put ourselves in that position, and if you do hear it or you see it, it's I think if I talk for longer I'm just going to obfuscate my own point, but yeah, I like virtue signaling doesn't help. So if you see an injustice, you should just correct it.
Yeah, I think to add to that, I think if someone is asking you the question, how can I be a better ally, whether it's to the deaf and disabled community or whether it's to somebody who's LGBT, I think you have to, remind them that it's not a checklist and it's kind of an almost continuous task, in that you can't just do one action and then therefore you're a good ally. It's a process, it's a method that you have to go through of thinking, oh, is this maybe the most accessible way of doing things, or maybe is this the best way of thinking about things for my LGBT friends. It should be something that you're continually thinking about, not a sort of checklist that you've asked one friend about and then sort of gone through the bullet points on.
Yeah, I think the thing I try and tell people is not to take things personally or center themselves when they're being an ally, because if they go through a checklist to make their event accessible and they're criticized for it being inaccessible in some way, often they'll then just say, well, I did this and I did that and I tried my hardest. And it's not really about them trying their hardest. It's not about them as a person, really. It's like they need to just not take it personally, but just try and make it about the people they're trying to actually be allies to, whether that's to do with disability, sexuality, gender, whatever it is. You just need to be like, well, the world isn't treating these people correctly, and I'm a part of that. And it doesn't mean that I'm a terrible person. It just means that I need to keep trying.
Yeah, I think that's a really, really good point to give to people particularly. And I think what I would add to that is that, as well as it feeling unsafe sometimes, going back to Beth's point, that it can also be really, really exhausting to always be the one who's making the point. So again, we're back to the emotional labour. But there's also, I think, a cultural shift that needs to kind of happen, because especially around disability, I think there's a sense that, oh, that just happens to that group of people, but actually anyone can become disabled at any point in their life. And so acknowledging that then means that accessibility supports everyone. And in being good allies, going back to what Umber said about not centering yourself, a big thing for me would be to get rid of the concept of full accessibility. If people are thinking about a checklist of access stuff, because if you talk about, yourself as being fully accessible, there's always going to be somebody who might turn up to your event and not find it accessible to them. And so then if you don't have this false ideal of completely full accessibility, and you acknowledge that there will always be learning and growth that needs to happen, then you're already in a place of, okay, we can have a productive conversation and change things. Whereas if you think, oh yes, I've made myself fully accessible because I've got a ramp or whatever, then yeah, so I think that phrase needs to be removed from language, because as much as it's a lovely utopic idea, there's always going to be someone who will need something slightly differently. And so if we can acknowledge that adaptability, I think it's a good place to start. Yeah. And following on from that question about allyship, how can we be good allies, and how can other people be good allies to us within the context of the specific global situation right now, the pandemic? That's kind of the last question.
Sorry, can you repeat the question? I couldn't hear.
Yeah.
Sorry, I think Zoom went off a bit then. It's essentially following on from the last one, which was how generally can people in the community be allies. And it's about how can people be allies within the context of COVID-19. So the specific
I would say
context.
The thing that's come up most to me is people, when the government lifts certain rules, people acting like it's safe and then expecting you to feel safe to do things that might be very dangerous, and then feeling a bit like you're being gaslit into like you're acting paranoid when this pandemic is so real and so many people are dying and it's not really getting better. So I'd say that allies really need to not assume that people feel safe going out, and also based on what they look like as well, because people do have invisible disabilities and invisible things that make them more vulnerable to this virus. If they don't, it's completely reasonable to be cautious at this time. And I'd say the most important thing is that people keep their distance and wear masks, and don't assume that you're comfortable with breaking those things, because a lot of people, like I went to the park to do a socially distanced meetup, and there was people I didn't know there who tried to hug me, and they were wearing masks, and I just thought, what are you doing? And it happens quite a lot. I don't know if it's just recently or what, but people are assuming that everything's fine. It's quite odd. So I'd say just like kind of common sense things, but I guess it's not that common.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. I think you made a really good point about people not assuming things. So not assuming other people's, whether they've got disabilities or health conditions or whatever, that might mean that they're less comfortable than some other people might be. But then also, yeah, not assuming whether or not people might fall into certain exemptions. So for example, I'm thinking of like masks. Generally everyone should wear masks, but there are some exceptions if somebody you're with is relying on lip reading, for example. So that if you do see, perhaps there's a pair and one person isn't wearing a mask, do ask yourself, well, maybe it is because one of them is relying on lip reading. You don't necessarily have to assume otherwise. But yeah, I think that's the key thing, Umber, isn't it? That people shouldn't assume what other people's situation is. And naturally, for a lot of disabled people, they will be quite cautious, and they've every right to be in the middle of a pandemic.
Yeah, I completely agree with both of you there. I think the kind of assumption that all disabled people are shielding, but also on the flip side of that, that we're somehow back to normal, and that as much as I'm not shielding myself, that I feel comfortable to be out and about. It's we're still in the middle, if not the beginning, of this pandemic, and it still scares me to kind of go outside and see the amount of people who are treating it like last summer in a way. But yeah, I think something that would be great to see people carry on would be to keep making the their online presence, I guess, as accessible as possible. And what I mean by that is adding alt text to your pictures and image descriptions and captions, which has been wonderful, actually. We're still not there, but there has been a huge increase in the amount of people doing this on their social media, and within my industry, within the theatre industry, it's become much more kind of commonplace that captions will be widely available and audio description will be widely available. So I think carrying this all on forever, that would be fantastic. It's not, you know, it's like that saying, a puppy's not just for Christmas. Like, access isn't just for the pandemic. If we can keep this going, that would be fantastic.
I love that. Access isn't just for the pandemic. And yeah, in relation to both Josh and Umber's points, another phrase popped into my head that one of my chronically ill friends used the other day, which was, the pandemic isn't over just because you're over it. And I think that's really true, that people sort of seem to be forgetting that there's something major going on in the world. And yeah, so I really hope that we don't get to a point where certain sections of the community, whether that be deaf and disabled people or people of colour or other marginalised groups, for a whole variety of reasons, just don't feel comfortable leaving their houses because the rest of society is just pretending that everything has gone back to normal. Not that normal was ever actually a fixed concept, but yeah, so I really hope that. And perhaps this is a good point to just talk briefly, because I think we were supposed to have somebody from the Disabled LGBT People's Organisation Regard here as well, but they couldn't make it. And one of the big things that they're campaigning about now is the position of a lot of LGBT plus disabled people in social care, or who are requiring social care support, because one of the big things that has happened with the coronavirus bill that was passed in early March is that now the Care Act of 2014 is not applicable, and so essentially people's care costs can be cut, and that there's no kind of legal protection against that anymore. But also, especially in terms of direct payment support, which I use myself, so I can employ my own personal assistant, that is used a lot by people in the LGBT community, because then you can employ people who will understand your sexuality or gender identity, and then feel safe and secure in your own home. And so the cuts to care, but also the vulnerability of people who require care support, is, I think, something that I hope is carried forward in the discussion, because I can't actually socially distance from people because I need a certain amount of support with my day-to-day life that means it's impossible. And I think going back to Josh's point about lip reading or sign language interpretation, there will be people who need support for a variety of reasons, who actually do need to be close to people. And so I think there's a very fine line between people being vulnerable and so needing the protection of masks and things, but also potentially people getting siloed off into kind of bubbles and not really being able to interact with other people because of their particular needs. And yeah, so I think it's a complicated one. I really hope we don't lose the more nuanced conversation that I think we've been having about interdependence and the way that society is set up throughout the pandemic. I do think that's been a positive change because we've thought more about social structures for a variety of reasons. But yeah. So, does anybody else have anything that they particularly want to bring up? Because I'm conscious that's a bit of a low point to end on.
Well, I think maybe to make it a bit more upbeat, I think to go back to what I was saying earlier, and this kind of leads on to what you were just saying, Jessie, as well. But I think the one positive, at least from all of this, is that it has made more people aware. I think more able-bodied people aware of the changes they can make, and it's put less of the back to the emotional labour kind of side of things as well. It's put less of the toll on deaf and disabled people to demand the changes, and people are making them because of the circumstances, and I think that's a positive, at least. Yeah, it's a shame that representative from Umber Ghauri couldn't be here about social care and LGBT and how they intersect, because I know in my own industry, so I'm a reporter, I think, especially in LGBT media, there's a real sort of blind spot around social care and how that impacts the LGBT community. And obviously, social care is really broad, so it can impact loads and loads of different people. But so, if you take, for example, elderly LGBT people who need social care, it's kind of a completely under-discussed topic, even within LGBT media. And so, all those kind of problems about, having to come back out when you're in a care home, for example, or yeah, things like that. Not having LGBT friendly care services, all that kind of stuff, just does kind of fall by the wayside. So it's kind of a shame that we weren't really able to probably talk about that.
Yeah, I think I was involved in a study not too long ago, which was about the experiences of LGBT plus disabled people who use direct payments to employ personal assistants. And one of the things that came out of it, no pun intended, was a statistic that didn't really surprise me, but I think is probably relevant, which is that 90% of the respondents, either to the survey or interviews, were not out to PAs. And that's always something that I question whether or not to have that conversation when I'm employing new people, because on the one hand, I want to feel safe with the people who I'm employing and be able to be open about all aspects of my identity. But when there's actually a crisis in care support and care availability, which I think is something that's only going to increase given current circumstances, because care workers are particularly vulnerable as well, given the number of people that they work with, then you don't always have that luxury. If you don't have that many people to choose who are going to get you out of bed. So yeah, it's a complex one, and obviously I'm very, very lucky to live independently. I don't live in a care home, but quite a number of younger disabled people as well are ending up in care settings because that's the only possibility for them. So hopefully that's another conversation that will be had, because I think particularly the learning disabled community, there's not been much talk about how the pandemic is impacting that aspect of the community. Within the more, I hate this word, but mainstream media conversations, I think members of the community themselves are trying to make it more of a conversation topic, but more generally, yeah.
Yeah, I think that's a really good thing to kind of say. It should be a conversation. Just to go back to what we've all said, I think like we as a community, we should be in the conversations to do with access. Because I mean, yeah, and also please keep the conversations going. The only way to kind of make this an equitable society is to just keep going. There's not going to be a fix-all strategy, kind of. So just to keep trying, keep talking, and keep being accepting and being the best ally you can. And I guess they're all kind of buzzwords at the moment, but the more that we kind of follow down this line, the better it's going to end up being. And I think just take care of yourselves and the community, and especially people from marginalized communities, because it is a scary time. And then when things do start opening again, when it's safe to, that will still be an anxiety-ridden place for a lot of people. So yeah, I guess just listen. That would be the biggest piece of advice, really. And don't kind of deny what people are saying. If that's what they're saying, that's what they're saying. So
yeah, I agree. I think it's about I think a lot of what people have realized under lockdown is that we could have been doing a lot of these things in the first place, as we mentioned before the conversation, and to think outside the box a bit more and outside of your perspective, and think, you know, if someone's XYZ is less accessible for them, are those things actually necessary? Are those barriers that are in place really that difficult to get rid of? Would it benefit people to do more things remotely, or to, you know, move things around in terms of budget, or just basically trying to open people's minds in terms of what accessibility looks like, and thinking more creatively as well, not being so bogged down in just this is the way things are done, because we've seen that can really shift in a heartbeat.
Yeah, I think that's a really powerful place to end, actually, the kind of outside the box thing. And it actually chimes with what I've been thinking about a lot over the course of lockdown, which is that actually we as LGBT plus people and deaf and disabled people actually have to think outside the box already. So in forging a new society that will come out of whatever is left after the pandemic, we are potentially quite powerful people to be having those conversations and have a useful perspective to offer. So hopefully people will be open to that perspective and the kind of expertise through lived experience that we have. Yeah. Thank you all for such a lovely conversation.
thank you for sharing. Yeah.